Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Here we are at last on the Franklin battlefield. We are approaching the end of our trip here, and of any of the places near the end of the trip, I think this is where you have to come. We are standing on the Carter House grounds. We are also at what some people might call right around the epicenter of the breakthrough at the Battle of Franklin. And we are going to talk about the battle. We're going to talk about the family, the incredible story of the Carter family. We're going to talk about the fighting on sort of this end of the line. We're later going to talk about the fighting on the other end of the line, or the eastern flank, and we'll learn about that and the incredible and well-told story of a cemetery there and a house called Carnton. So we've got a lot to cover here, and really, if you came here 10, 20 years ago, come back. The unbelievable story of not the preservation, not just preservation and restoration, literally reclamation of this site will blow you away. I still can't believe it. And we got a lot to talk about in one video here, so let's waste no more time. CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust, the legendary Eric Jacobson.
Hey everybody, so we're standing in the yard of the Carter House. I think it might be good to kind of set the table and think about this ground was not saved, was not even open to the public until the early 1950s. And really this small little tract really that kind of shoots off to my left was about all there was of the Battle of Franklin for many decades. And almost every inch of ground that we're going to cover on the rest of our tour around Franklin is all stuff that's been saved really in the last 10 to 20 years. It's, I think, the greatest reclamation, preservation story of Civil War battlefield anywhere in the country. I'm pretty biased, but it's an incredible story. What happens here for just a few short hours on November 30th, 1864 really is hell on earth. I mean, it is the worst of combat. It's as bad as it ever got. And really, I think Franklin, I've argued for years, it had to happen. It didn't need to happen here. It was supposed to happen south of here, closer to Spring Hill. But Franklin, like other small towns, just found itself in the crosshairs of war. So let's get started. Want to hit this one first?
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the really interesting pieces of the reclamation story and preservation isn't just ground, it's buildings. And what we have in Franklin is the ability to tell the story through the use of historic structures. This was the Carter Farm Office. This building for decades was never open to the public. So we decided to restore it about a half a dozen years ago, and all the original walls had been replaced. And so as we were breaking through the modern mid-20th century walls, we started to see bullet holes. And the moment that I saw these bullet holes and the light streaming through them and casting, this kind of imagery and the light shift throughout the day as the sun moves, we made the decision right there. We were never going to cover these walls up. You have to see it. Guests see this every day. This is the wow moment at the end of every tour. You're looking south, mostly Confederate bullets. Looking north, mostly Federal bullets. Some of these pass through both walls. It's just an incredible moment. And we tell people that what you're looking at is really some of the final violent spasms of our terrible Civil War. And what a better place to do it than in a building once owned by civilians, the quiet peace of day-to-day life ripped apart by war.
I just can't stress enough. Video does not do it justice to see and to experience the testament to such a terrible battle. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're here with CEO Eric Jacobson at the Battle of Franklin Trust.
All right, guys, let's head south. So what we're going to do is we're going to move toward where the main federal or U.S. position began to be established early on Wednesday, November 30th, 1864. So as we talked about at Spring Hill, there's this great escape. John Schofield's army marches all night. They begin to arrive here at Franklin. And if you kind of pan around, you can see that we are actually on a hill. So what the U.S. troops, particularly the engineers, are looking for, they're looking for the right topography. They want to get the right position because when they arrived, it was quickly determined they weren't going to be able to move beyond Franklin. John Schofield realizes he cannot get across the Harpeth River, which is north of here to my left. And it wasn't because the river was at flood stage, which is something that commonly gets bantied about. It's really because the Harpeth has incredibly steep banks, and Schofield's got lots of stuff. And so it's going to take hours just to get everything across, but he's got to get the bridges in passable condition. So he orders Brigadier General Jacob Cox to set up at the Carter House and begin to set up a defensive front. Think about this. We're standing on ground that until the last decade was covered by development. There were 2 homes that stood here, one directly to my front left, one directly to my front right. This was a 1.6 acre tract that we, with help from the American Battlefield Trust, our partners with the state, federal American Battlefield Protection Program funding, we saved this 1.6 acre tract. It cost $2.8 million. I had people ask me almost every day while we were raising money for this, is it worth it? Is it worth that much money? Yes, it's worth every single penny, because look around. You can now get a sense of what was Carter Hill, what was part of the Carter Garden. And on November 30th, U.S. troops begin to shred this area. So right over here, one of the other things that we had to do as part of the reclamation effort, we had to do archaeological digs. We had a rough idea of where the U.S. line was, where the earthworks or trenches were, and sure enough, we found them. Just beyond this sign is where the 50th Ohio begins to set up, part of Thomas Ruger's division. Ruger's been everywhere, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville. He ends up out west. The line begins to wrap around the hill. 72nd Illinois off to my west. So what happens over the course of a few hours is the bulk of Schofield's army sets up. Jacob Cox's division is east of here from Columbia Pike to the river. Ruger's division is here. Nathan Kimball's division establishes itself to the northwest. So by about noon, and it's, what time is it, guys? 9 o'clock in the morning? I mean, they're in the middle of it, and this is exactly what the weather was like. It was warm, it was in the, mid-50s, and so by noon, they've got everything set up on the main line. But remember, they weren't planning for a battle. This is all just a big stalling tactic. They're gonna get the heck out of here as soon as they can. But coming up behind the Federal Army, John Bell Hood. And he had uncovered, or he had learned early on November 30th, 1864, as he awoke at Spring Hill, that the U.S. Army had escaped. So Hood begins a rapid pursuit. Let's head over this way so you can see the Columbia Turnpike. And we're gonna take a quick look south. So what is Hood thinking the morning of November 30th? Hard to say. Is he frustrated? Is he upset? Who wouldn't be? The entire enemy army has gotten away. So when Hood begins this aggressive pursuit, he doesn't really think Schofield's gonna stop till he gets to Nashville. But Schofield had to stop. Because when he gets to Franklin, as I described, he's got big problems. So here's Columbia Pike. And if you pan toward the south, you can see the battlefield at Franklin. A lot of people would describe it as being flat. It's not. It has these rolls in the terrain. It's a lot like Gettysburg, You walk that ground where Pickett's men charged. It's not flat. So what Hood does when he arrives here is he can see what's set up in front of him. He can see the U.S. Army has deployed in a defensive position, but this is a temporary position. He knows these are temporary earthworks. He knows Schofield is going to leave. Everything indicates Schofield's going to pull up stakes and get out of here. And sure enough, he was, because by 2 o'clock that afternoon, evacuation orders were in place. The U.S. Army was going to leave. They were going to go to Nashville. Hood has short time to make a decision. Easy to look back and say, well, he shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have made the decision to attack, but he did. We have to deal in facts. And when Hood got here and he looks over this ground, he sees one last chance to hit Schofield, to try and destroy him, and maybe retake Nashville.
And just real quick, I can't move another inch without talking about this. Eric already mentioned that there were a couple of houses right off to the right of the camera, but here, right across the road, there was a strip center here. There was a Mexican restaurant. There was a pizza place. If that's not enough, give us a Pizza Hut down a little bit further. Give us residential housing over here. And this is why we call it reclamation, where a half acre, quarter acre, 1 acre at a time, at very large cost, and due to the generosity of the members of the Battle of Franklin Trust, the American Battlefield Trust, the American Battlefield Protection Program, and others. Franklin, as a community, has really come together to open up this battlefield, and I seriously just can't believe it. Wait till we go over to the cotton gin. Chris. Mikowski emerging Civil War.
One of the things I love about this restoration is they've done a wonderful job with interpretation to help us understand what we're looking at. The signage here is first class. They've got some artillery positions to help stake things out. And I'm going to ask Chris to come over here just for a second because Eric had mentioned the Union works that were put here, and they've got them marked out with lines of gravel so you can see where all of those took place. I'm going to ask Eric to come back on in just a second to talk about some of the archaeology that helped them figure all this out and what those works look like. But before I do, I just kind of want to add something to our conversation about the leadership here on both sides. Eric pointed out yesterday that John Schofield is coming up from Columbia, heading toward Nashville in that direction. And there's a lot of concern or sort of popular mythology suggests that he's got the Confederates nipping at his heels the whole way. He's running scared. But in fact, Schofield is bold. He's deliberate. He's smart about what he's doing. We saw at Spring Hill yesterday that he makes a bold gamble going up that Columbia Pike. Now, we can all rattle off all our favorite Union commanders who are afraid to be bold. Schofield is bold at just the right time, a calculated risk. And that word calculated is really important as he makes his way up here. When he gets here, he's not trying to get pell-mell across that river. He knows he's got to protect his rear as he tries to get across that river. So again, very smart in the way he is trying to protect himself, very deliberate about what he's trying to do to get further north. And as Eric pointed out, he's not rushing across that river when it's time. He's sending out orders, getting ready to evacuate in an orderly fashion. And I think we forget about those things with Schofield because the popular misconception is that he's running scared. He's not. He's a guy who's going to become General-in-Chief of the Army after William T. Sherman. You don't rise to that level unless you've got something going on. And it might be his beard, but it might be the fact that he is more competent than people give him credit for. And then I want to just briefly mention John Bell Hood. Again, people think he's like suffering from a laudanum haze and he's drugged and making these silly, stupid decisions. But as Eric pointed out, the stakes are high. This is a last chance. It looks like he's got an opportunity here. It might not be an ideal opportunity, but it is his last opportunity, and he's got to try to make something happen. Eric, just wanted to bring you back on real quick to talk about, and then whatever you want to talk about, but the archaeology you've done to kind of stake this out is fascinating to me.
Well, so we've done 3 major archaeological digs at Carter Hill. So the first occurred just to the west, then we hit another one to the east, and then we doubled back and we hit this area. Now, we found all of the typical things you might find, lots of military stuff, and really a mixture, which I think is a testament to how insane and crazy some of the combat was. But I have to say, I think the most revealing thing that we found, so when you look at this crushed rock, this was placed to mark where the line was, but it's also meant to protect what remains of the earthworks underneath. It prevents washing, it prevents a lot of things from growing in it. But what was really amazing is all these stories about how the earthworks were 5, 6, 7 feet high, and the Confederates were having to scale the earthworks. There may have been some of that. All of the evidence in this area indicates the earthworks were probably 2 to 3 feet high, topped off by fence rails. They're ripping apart the Carter's cotton gin. They're throwing that on top. Remember, these are veterans. These guys don't want to do any more than they have to, and they don't think they're going to stay. So as Hood later wrote, these were temporary works. The evidence is clear. They dug down about 18 to 24 inches. They threw the earth in front. So you've got, a trench that's 1.5 feet deep. You got maybe a foot or two of dirt in front. That's it. That's what's so cool, not just about the reclamation effort, but finding what the archaeology shows you and what's the evidence. So let's head to the east side of Columbia Pike. We're going to dodge traffic like the old game Frogger. It's Frogger, remember? We have to not get hit. So on this side of the road, one of the coolest archaeological finds was the foundation of the old cotton gin. So the Carters built a gin in the early 1850s because they were growing cotton. But before we get to that site, let's talk about one other element of the U.S. defensive position that never gets enough credit: artillery. I'm a little biased about artillery. I think it's the coolest wing of the armies because it inflicts just unbelievable damage. And maybe the bias is because it's something we talk about both at Carter House and Carnton every day, the power of this arm of the U.S. Army. So check this out. The main line's right here. So 100th Ohio, part of Tom Ruger's division, begins to set up here. The line moves east. supporting the 100th Ohio, 4 guns of the 1st Kentucky Battery. We're not just reclaiming battlefield, digging in the ground, finding cool stuff, putting up interpretive markers. We're buying replica artillery pieces. So these babies are about $15,000 each. We had to raise the money for that, but this is where the 1st Kentucky was. One thing about artillerists, especially by this stage of the war, they knew their game really, really well. These guns are angled not due south to the southwest to control a knoll, a hill out to the southwest. They're placed with unbelievable precision. So just keep that in mind as we hit various points on the line. You see these artillery pieces. These are placed to inflict the maximum casualties.
And thanks, Eric. And let me just say, I think we've just heard the word cool more than we have on any other video, which is maybe appropriate somehow of why sometimes I'm called the Eric Jacobson of the East, because history is cool. History is interesting. History can be reverent as well. We can do it all on battlefields, and you should engage with your battlefield in the way that's appropriate to you. There is no one way to act on a battlefield, and veterans knew that as well. They had fun. They were reverent. They remembered. They did everything on a battlefield, and you should engage in the way you find appropriate.
Well, I just since we're talking about the Gary Edelman of the West, maybe we should.
Hold on, I have a tiny little head with a tiny little brain, so.
Does it fit?
No, it doesn't. Eric, come on back. I think we need to bring up some more fighting here.
Absolutely. So let's go further east down the line. So we're going to head to the gin, and then we're going to double back, and we're really going to talk about the apex of the battle when the Confederates blow through the center and how the U.S. Army barely holds on. I can't stress this enough. Too often, conversations about Franklin are, Hood was stupid, the Confederates never had a chance, Hood never should have done this. By the time you're done watching this, I hope one thing is obvious. Not only is Franklin super important, the Confederates come this close. Hood's desperate gamble almost works, and only through this weird, odd, incredible combination of events on the U.S. side do they hold the Confederates back. So as we look, let's pan back. Let's pan back toward where we just were standing. Notice how the line is changing direction. Why is the line changing direction? Once again, the engineers and the troops are dealing with a topographical issue, but now they're dealing with something else. A big, big building that once stood directly ahead. The Cotton Gin was a 2-story, roughly 35 by 35 wood frame structure. Well, you can't move it, and you don't want it in front of the line, and now I'm walking backwards. The very thing the director told me not to do, I'm walking backwards. So the gin stood right here. Again, they don't want the gin in front of the line, so they work the line around in front of the Cotton Gin.
I can't believe, again, standing here, I can't believe it. So what you've done here with the rocks to allow you to see the Union position, and of course what we're about to see over here, I just can't believe what it's like to stand here, having stood across that road, having seen this strip center, and how loud it was, and this was all concrete, and there was a little house here. I just can't believe it.
I have to say, I remember standing kind of, right over maybe in this area, and there was Pizza Hut, Domino's, cinder block strip mall, house, and you would stand there, and there would be like a dumpster behind the strip mall. And I remember thinking, how did this happen? How did this incredible story get covered up by all this modernization? So it's just wonderful to see it as open as it is, and it looks like a battlefield, right? So come on over here. We didn't know exactly where the Federal line was. So we didn't exactly know where the gin was. We had maps, but maps can be off by 10, 20 feet. We started digging over here. Couldn't find anything indicating this is where the gin was. And we're like, well, maybe there's nothing left. Then we went a little further north. Check this out. We found essentially what you'd call the footers. This is the subsurface stone that had to be laid in place so the building could rest atop it. Kind of like the footers of your house today. And it was just an incredible find. So you have a corner of the gin, back corner of the gin, back corner of the gin, front corner of the gin. Main line works around that building. A 2-gun section of the 6th Ohio sits right on the southeast corner of the gin, aimed due south. If you look that way, you can see once again, this is a hill. That is a killing field out there. This is like the angle at Gettysburg. This is exactly where you want the line. This is exactly where you want your maximum artillery support. So the Confederate Army, having made the decision, or the Confederate commander rather, having made the decision to attack, there's this really incredible spectacle that plays out between about 1 and 3 o'clock or 3:30 that afternoon as the Southern Army forms up about 1.75 miles south of here. They all know what's going to happen. And they have to get right in their own heads what's about to ensue. The guys on this side don't know. Schofield, Jacob Cox, none of the Federal commanders believe that Hood would actually try this. And then at 4 o'clock it begins. We may never be able to save much of the ground south of here, but we have some of the most important preserved forever. I say to myself all the time, imagine watching this spectacle come this way. John Bell Hood launched an attack at 4 o'clock that afternoon, far bigger than Pickett's charge. It's one of the largest of the war. I mean, it's not the size of Gaines' Mill, but this is an unbelievable attack. 6 full divisions, 20,000 men. The front is almost 2 miles wide. Everyone who survived this on the Federal side said they just never forgot what happened here. It is just like a human tidal wave rolling this way. There's one spot we have to hit, which is really one of the most poignant on the battlefield. So let's head this way. I think everybody who's familiar with the Civil War, let alone Franklin, knows who Pat Cleburne was. Pat Cleburne had been, along with his troops, engaged the day before at Spring Hill. When Cleburne got here and learned of the decision to attack, he, like others, was concerned about the inevitable cost. However, Cleburne's a soldier, and soldiers have to follow orders. And so he formed his men up, their left flank on Columbia Pike, their right extending to the east of here, and they advanced. Cleburne led about 3,000 men into combat that afternoon. 2 horses struck out from under him, and in the end, it was as if Cleburne was almost like a company commander of infantry. He went in on foot with his men. We know through evidence just recently uncovered in the last 10 years that there's no doubt that Cleburne had decided that he wasn't going to send his men into a place that he himself would not go. We unveiled this marker half a dozen years ago. It roughly denotes where Cleburne fell. His division was wrecked, 50% casualties. Cleburne is killed. Hiram Granberry, one of his brigade commanders, also killed. Mark Lowry, Dan Govan make it through the combat. But guys like Cleburne were just irreplaceable. I mean, the Army of Tennessee would be wrecked at Franklin, but their command structure was also terribly, terribly damaged. But what Cleburne's men do, and what John Brown's troops do to the west of the road, to my front, is effect a massive breakthrough in the center of the U.S. position. So that's what we're going to hit next.
Okay, good. And, we have to bring this along a little bit more. Let me foreshadow a little bit that some of these, maybe not some of these same guys, because some of them wouldn't make it through the battle, but, you look at Granberry's unit, you look at Lowry, you look at Govan, and you're going to see them at Nashville. And what's funny is that you've seen them at Perryville, you've seen them at Chickamauga, you're going to see them at Bentonville as well. These are the same troops, sometimes being reinforced and everything like that, but, these are the same troops. It's just unbelievable that that some of these units are even still around even without their commanders. So I think what we're going to do now as we walk over is try to tie up the battle a little bit more, bring in one particularly famous aspect of the battle. So is this you next, or do we go straight to him?
I think what we're going to back up just a bit, and we're going to talk about George Wagner's division and Wagner's role in the battle. But also one of really the greatest myths of the battle, that there's this singular person who saved the day for the U.S. Army. And for that, we're going to turn it over to Joseph, one of the historians and historical interpreters here with the Battle of Franklin Trust.
Hey, So, George Wagner's division is the 2nd Division of the 4th Army Corps under David Stanley. They are the last troops to arrive here in Franklin. And they leave Spring Hill around 4 o'clock in the morning. They get their orders to pull back. So they were the first into Spring Hill, and they are now the last out. And then they're going to arrive here in Franklin at 11 o'clock in the morning on Winstead Hill, about 2 miles to the south of us. From that position, they are still carrying out their task as the rear guard element of the Federal Army as they make their escape here to Franklin. George Wagner is as good of a soldier as you get, but his men, about 5,600 of them, are a steady mix of both veteran troops and green replacements that have just been mustered into the Army about a month or so before in most cases. As they make their position on Winstead Hill, they start to get pressured by the Confederate advanced elements as they come forward, so then they withdraw to Privet Knob, about 1.5 miles south of us. And then from that point, they end up about 450 yards to the south of us, down here on Columbia Pike. And the apex of their line is almost visible from right here, because you can see a larger notch in the road just behind me. As the ground slopes up, that's roughly the point of Wagner's division. As he puts his 2 brigades and starts to place all 3 of his brigades, the 1st Brigade under Emerson Opdyke, the 2nd Brigade under Joseph Conrad, and the 3rd Brigade under John Lane, they start to pull back into that position. Opdyke will make a contesting argument with Wagner. The fact that his men had been in a mile-long skirmish line throughout most of the night, withdrawing back here to Franklin. He says that his men are tired, that they're hungry. Wagner agrees. There's this long story, this long-told story, that Wagner and Opdyke had a feud and they argued with each other the whole way up the road. There is no evidence of that, save for one account from a man that was 600 yards away. It's debatable whether or not he could even hear it. Everything that he puts together comes in post-war recollections. They move to the back, where we're going to head to now, with those 2 brigades still out front, Lane and Conrad. John Lane and Joseph Conrad have a combined 36 hours in command of these brigades. Most of their men, unlike Opdyke's brigade, are those green replacements, those new conscripts, those substitute soldiers that have just been mustered in. So they start to make their way back here, Opdyke's brigade does, moving to the back of Carter Hill, and they are placed then in reserve of the entire army, and they will be just beneath the back slope of Carter Hill. And it will turn out to be the greatest afterthought of the battle.
Let me jump in just for a quick second. Chris, point the camera uphill for a second so we can really get a sense of this uphill crest that Eric and Joe have been talking about. I mean, we have this nice open advance that the Federals are going to have to come across, and then we've got this little crest that we can still hide behind here.
All right, so at this moment, the battle is about to reach its apex. So Wagner is in position. He's got 2 brigades out front. Opdyke's behind me to the north. The Confederate assault commences. Now, those 3,000 guys out front, they don't even have a chance. They stand and fight, but eventually they fall back, and this debacle begins to ensue, which is exactly what John Bell Hood was hoping, that he could blow apart the advance line and then shove them right into the main line, using them almost like a shield. And that's exactly what happens. And at around 4:25, 4:30 that afternoon, this unbelievable cataclysm begins to develop right here in the center. 4 entire regiments of the U.S. Army are blown back off the line. And to the earlier point about, the stories about Wagner and the stories about Opdyke for years got all the credit for saving the day. Right here is almost the high watermark for the Confederate Army. Main line to my right, main line to my left. They blast through this area, but if you kind of pan to the front left and you see the Carter House, farm office, smokehouse, and then this house to the right, this is the secondary line. There's a secondary line of troops that were placed in this area at about 12 o'clock. Particularly, 2 regiments of new troops and a 3rd regiment of new troops were placed on the secondary line And they take the body blow from the Confederate Army. They buy precious moments for the Federal Army when there are very few moments to be had, and they pay for it with a tremendous cost. 2 Ohio regiments and a Missouri regiment take close to 350 or 400 casualties in just a matter of moments. And what they do, we're now right about where the secondary line was. They hold this ground. They refuse to pull back. There's a counter-assault on the east side of the road. There's a holding action by the 44th Missouri to the west of the road. And this is really where the Confederates start running into this wall of both flesh, wood, steel, and lead. And then Updike, whose men are down in this hollow almost 200 yards to the north, they're veterans. And almost by instinct, they rise up and they rush into the fray. Some of his units end up west of the road. Some of his regiments end up east of the road. Everything we've just described happens by about 4:50 to 5 o'clock. The battle is barely an hour old, but now darkness is beginning to settle on the field. And for the next 2 or 3 hours, these two armies just pound and beat on one another relentlessly. What happened was, Hood took advantage of a tactical mistake by George Wagner. He ripped this massive hole in the main line, but only because of concerted action by some of the veterans who were rallied from out front, the new guys, and Updike's guys pouring into the breach. It's almost like 1, 2, 3, and they seal this hole off. But what's the most awful part of Franklin is that these two armies who'd been fighting for so long, they get into this death struggle. But the Southern Army is never going to be able to recover from the beating it takes here. By the time the battle ends at about 9 o'clock, there's almost 10,000 casualties. Close to 2,500 dead, 7,000 wounded, almost 1,000 missing. And then Franklin was almost forgotten. And it wasn't the veterans. I can't stress enough, it wasn't the veterans. They wanted to save this. They wanted this to be a national park. They wanted people to come here. They wanted you to come and see it. So now, I think in many ways, we fulfilled their wishes. They wanted you to come and see this ground, to really see where the last titanic struggles of this war played out. And I think to understand the end, because ultimately this does lead to Appomattox in an indirect way, it certainly leads to the surrender of North Carolina, you gotta come to Franklin. You gotta go to Spring Hill to understand Franklin, and then you've gotta stand right here.
I want to just kind of follow up on what he's saying, because as I'm coming here and having him unfold that fantastic story, and Eric, what an amazing storyteller, standing here on the ground is incredible, because as Eric pointed out earlier, this was a near thing for the Confederates. Even though we tend to look at it in terms that they talk about this being a Pyrrhic victory, it was a near thing. If we look back down the pike, as Eric was pointing out, look at the ground that the Confederates had to cross, and think about the artillery positions that Eric pointed out to us. They were set up to make that a killing field, and still the Confederates managed to get up here and break through and stay for that titanic struggle. So walking the ground, being able to see the topography is absolutely key to understanding that titanic struggle.
I think we're going to wrap it up here. This is an incredible story. We only hit the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to it, which is like why all places, why you have to come here. Engage with some of the excellent interpreters here at the Battle of Franklin Trust, and I'm really, I feel really fortunate that we've had Eric and Joseph here with us today. To Chris White behind the camera, I'll later post a video showing what it's like to shoot someone like Eric Jacobson. He's running around, he's trying to do assets at the same time. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Chris Mikowski. Thanks to Joseph, our good new friend Joseph, whose parents rock and his mom rocks. Thanks for joining us. And to Eric Jacobson, CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust. What a great job he's done here. And thank you to all of you, all y'all who have helped to support the preservation and reclamation of this battlefield. We might ask you for more help before long, but for now, thank you. Get inspired at battlefields.org.